Britain faces a showdown over a federal Europe at this week's summit. It'll be a test of political will, the foreign ministers were told today. The Chancellor says there probably won't be a single European currency this century. And Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, enemy of apartheid, returns to South Africa. Good evening. This week's European summit is building up into a test of wills over the future of the community. The foreign ministers met in Luxembourg today to sort out the agenda. Instead of it being what Britain wanted, merely a review of progress towards economic and political union, it contains a series of proposals which Britain rejects. The reference in a new draft treaty to a future federal Europe stays, and on the agenda calls for faster progress on a common foreign and defence policy, more powers for the European Parliament, extending the social charter, and transferring vast sums of money from the rich north to the poor south. Britain opposes all of them.
Britain's Minister Tristan Garel-Jones arrived in Luxembourg to restate the government's opposition to a federal Europe and greater EC power. But the man responsible for the political union talks now believes the EC summit in 6 days' time should be used to push the whole process forward, isolating Britain on federalism if necessary.
It will remain in the text, and we will try to get a common definition, a common understanding what federalism means in the longer term.
And Mr. Poos says he hopes Britain's scepticism can eventually be overcome.
I don't think the objection is irreversible.
The Italian foreign minister believes only prayer will help find a compromise in this debate, but during today's meeting, other ministers proved more pragmatic and willing to wait for divine inspiration. The majority agreed that the summit will be asked to give guidelines on the way forward in certain key areas, although Britain hopes it won't be ambushed into making decisions now, instead able to wait until the Maastricht summit next December.
Well, I don't think we're going to fall out, but equally I think that when we reach Maastricht, an agreement will be made. It will be made by consensus. I'm perfectly confident that it's going to be a very good agreement for Britain and a triumph for John Major.
Some countries, such as Germany, have given assurances again today that they won't try to embarrass Britain at this week's summit. But Mr. Garel-Jones goes home tonight unable to reassure John Major about how events will turn out. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, Luxembourg.
The Chancellor, Norman Lamont, has said he doesn't foresee a single European currency this century. He's been at a meeting of the 7 finance ministers from leading industrial nations. Their discussions ended with no announcement of any immediate action to control the value of the dollar, and that could mean British interest rates may be forced up again.
Today's hurriedly arranged meeting was called against the background of German worries about the recently soaring dollar. But if anything at all was agreed today, it was well concealed behind the standard communiqué language for all occasions.
Ministers and governors reviewed recent developments in international financial markets and reaffirmed their commitment to cooperate closely, taking account of the need for orderly markets, if necessary, through appropriately concerted action in exchange markets. That is the wording of the communiqué, and as I said, I do not propose to say anything further about it beyond that.
Foreign currency markets tomorrow morning will be unimpressed, and the dollar may resume its long upward march, 20% this year, which was briefly suspended at the end of the week, only after the announcement of today's meeting. The strong dollar forces up the cost of Germany's already mushrooming import bill and threatens the thing they fear most, inflation. If the group of 7 won't act to buck the foreign exchange market, then Germany may have to act alone to protect the Deutschmark. The pound too has in practice been devalued by the rise in the dollar, thus helping British exports and the prospects for an eventual end to the recession. Indeed, the Chancellor takes some comfort from this and believes this stimulus to have been worth the equivalent of at least a 1% cut in interest rates. But he's under no illusions about the danger for all his plans, political and economic, of a possible rise in German interest rates.
Obviously, a rise in German interest rates would not be welcome from a British viewpoint, but I believe that the pound is strong, and I believe that we have credibility in the markets, and I believe people know that inflation is coming down.
Coming down it certainly is, but British interest rates can only come down, as the Chancellor hopes, if German rates don't rise. And in the apparent absence of any meaningful agreement about the dollar at today's Group of Seven meeting, the Chancellor could still find himself, in Mrs. Thatcher's phrase, the innocent bystander at the scene of a very nasty accident if the Germans now feel obliged to raise their rates in order to defend the Deutschmark.
Here, the Confederation of British Industry and opposition parties are urging the Chancellor to reduce interest rates straight away. A survey to be published by the CBI tomorrow says demand and output are showing no signs of recovery.
The CBI's latest survey contains little of cheer for the government. It says industry remains firmly in the grip of the recession. Order books remain weak and output's expected to continue to fall over the next 4 months. The CBI say further cuts in interest rates are needed urgently to lift business confidence and reduce the costs of investment. Labour say up to 250,000 jobs could be lost by the autumn and 10,000 companies go to the wall if interest rates aren't reduced.
When businessmen are reporting that investment is 20% down in manufacturing industry on a year ago, when outputs are 5 to 6% down, and when you have the fastest rising unemployment in Europe, it is not enough for the Chancellor to say he may act at a later stage. We need decisive action on interest rates, as indeed the Americans are proposing now.
It takes about 9 or 12 months for the improvements to work through, and unless he begins to respond to what the CBI are saying and starts to cut interest rates again now, you will not see an improvement right through the autumn, and you will have a winter of deepening, rising unemployment.
But the Chancellor predicts the upturn will start in the second half of the year. He argues the 3.5% cut in interest rates so far will take time to have an effect.
That will have an effect on consumer confidence and on industrial confidence. But even now, when you look at surveys of business opinion and consumer confidence, gradually, month by month, sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. But the trend is for confidence to increase.
Also tomorrow, the trade figures for May will be published. They'll be scrutinised anxiously by politicians and economists alike for what they tell us about Britain's export performance, a key indicator of the underlying strength of the country's industry and commerce.
Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, the veteran British anti-apartheid campaigner, has returned to a hero's welcome in South Africa, 35 years after he had to leave the country. His arrival followed the first direct talks this weekend between the government, the ANC and the Zulu Inkatha movement. They agreed to try to draw up a peace plan to end the township violence.
At Johannesburg's Jan Smuts Airport, a reunion of veteran anti-apartheid campaigners. Archbishop Trevor Huddleston worked here with both Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo in the 1950s before prison and exile drove them apart. Now the founder of the anti-apartheid movement is back to open the ANC's national conference at a critical moment in the country's violent transition away from apartheid and towards majority rule. Hardly pausing for rest, the Archbishop plunged into a regional ANC meeting discussing strategy for that conference. Greeted as a hero by a generation too young to know him except by reputation. Still a radical, the Archbishop himself insists.
And the new South Africa itself could not possibly be born if there was any kind of compromise with apartheid itself.
The conference will be a stiff test for the ANC as it struggles to make the transition from liberation movement to political party. At a township rally, Nelson Mandela dismissed reports of internal divisions between militants and moderates on the central question of negotiations with President de Klerk. Mr. Mandela welcomed the progress made at yesterday's first peace talks with Inkatha and the government, but did not minimise the huge gulf that still has to be bridged. James Robbins, BBC News, Johannesburg.
Cambodia's 4 warring factions say they'll stop fighting tomorrow, officially ending the 12-year civil war. Prince Sihanouk, who heads a guerrilla coalition, announced the ceasefire at talks in Bangkok with the Phnom Penh government after the Khmer Rouge dropped its opposition to peace moves.
This is the war that seems to have gone on forever. Cambodia has been a battlefield for 20 years, with a brief interlude in the mid-70s when things got even worse. Then the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot killed 1 million of its own people in notorious acts of genocide. The regime was eventually driven from power by a Vietnamese invasion. The guerrilla war has been raging ever since. When Vietnamese troops pulled out 2 years ago, there was the first glimmer of hope for peace. It was followed by several rounds of talks between the Vietnamese-backed regime of Hun Sen and the guerrillas' provisional government headed by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who'd ruled Cambodia until 1970. An end to the fighting was initially announced last year, but the peace proved flimsy and the Khmer Rouge again took up arms. Today in Bangkok, Prince Sihanouk said all the parties had now accepted an unconditional ceasefire, which would take effect from tomorrow. He threatened to isolate the Khmer Rouge from any settlement if they continue to block moves towards peace. Under the United Nations plan, all 4 groups will be represented on a national ruling council until elections can be organised. The plan also calls for military factions to be disarmed under UN supervision. But after 2 decades of bloody civil war, the possibility of the ceasefire holding must be in considerable doubt.
Talks in Liverpool over the weekend have failed to end the dustmen's work to rule over planned redundancies. The City Council and union leaders are to meet tomorrow.
The threat to Liverpool's refuse collection service rose this weekend after talks had failed and 460 bin men received their formal dismissal notices. The bin men were given an ultimatum by their bosses: agree the terms for clearing the city's backlog of refuse, or by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning they would call on private contractors to do the job. Union leaders say the council are withholding nearly 50% of the bin men's earnings by deducting bonuses because of the work to rule. But if the men are having to work flat out to clear the backlog, they say the bonuses should be reinstated.
The council are now demanding that they clear up all the backlog during the last 3 months. I think it's only fair that they should receive all the pay that they would have been owed. It's a simple solution to the problem. If the refuse collectors are going to give 100% more, in actual fact, the council should give 100% back to them. What the council are trying to do is to fine them, punish them by withdrawing their wages and then making threats about redundancy money. That's wrong.
Some union officials calculate that the bin men could lose between